Hello, everyone. My name is Wayne Barnum. This is the quarter three MSPDP topic lecture on the motion the United States should implement universal basic income. Originally, I thought this was a very awkward topic, but it's kind of grown on me, and I think that it'll actually be a very good one that you will likely see at your state tournament here at the end of April. We're going to cover four things in this lecture. Firstly, we're going to talk about models for universal basic income, or essentially how you're supposed to explain it to your judge. Then we're going to talk about framework, how you should explain certain ways to look at the round to your judge. Then we're going to go over more understanding of what universal basic income is, and then we're going to talk about cases for and against that I essentially screenshotted and stole from Britannica, because that's where I likely think that you're going to get them as well. Okay, what are models? Models explain how the resolution is supposed to work in the first minute of the first proposition speaker's speech. There's iffy on if it's supposed to be a first minute, however long you need to explain it. Specifically, models explain what the debate fundamentally looks like in terms of what actually changes. How do we understand this in terms of this topic? When we're thinking about what types of models need to occur, there's two, either policy motion models or value motion models. This motion is a policy one in that an actor, being the United States, is the one implementing this policy. So when we know this, we're really thinking about how does the debate change, or how does the actor change the way that the debate is supposed to function? Values motions, just like a good little lecture. And you can understand this on a different way in a different day. Explore ways that you're supposed to understand more principled argumentation or more principled ways to view the world. But for now, let's stay in the pragmatic understanding. What goes into a model? Necessarily, there's three things, or like those three subsections under part two. One, what are the problems with the world that needs fixing, and how should that happen? In that, a good model explains why we're having this debate in the first place. Either you can explain that the United States right now is cutting back on its social welfare for its citizens, and so as a result, it means that there's less help for people. Or you could also explain that right now, that affordability in the United States is going down, and so the debate, knowing these things, is really about how do we address these two issues, and is universal basic income the best way to address them? So then secondly, where in the world is this taking place? We already kind of know this because it's given in the motion. Specifically, it's in the United States. You can explain specifically who kind of implements this by looking at the third question of who should be in charge of making things happen. Because the point of the second question is to differentiate the round to explain this isn't about Canada's attempts in Ontario, and this isn't about Denmark or the Scandinavian countries that have taken some steps to implement this. This is about the United States, whether or not attempts to see if it'll work is likely to be beneficial or negative in long term. And so when we're thinking about those things, the third question points us towards the actors that implement this. A team can very easily explain that maybe this is the Department of Agriculture because they're the ones that have control over SNAP, so like benefits that already exist for citizens, or it can be like a new department that's created, or different ways to explain. There's 100 ways to understand it, but necessarily explaining these three parts of a model do three things. It explains to the judge why we need to have the debate in the first place. It explains where we're having the debate, so it limits the ground for both teams, but makes the debate a lot more understandable, digestible, and fair. But then thirdly, that it makes it easier to do actor analysis of specific things and how we're supposed to understand the people who are going about and implementing universal basic income. This will be more clear when we get to different types of arguments, but we can talk about like ways to view rounds on how maybe a government has a responsibility to do things different from another type of actor. This would go necessarily to the second part of the topic lecture on framework. There's not a good place to put my camera, so if you want to read that right now, do go ahead. Okay, we're good. What is framework? Framework is the way that you can frame or evaluate your contentions. Weighing should be the biggest thing that you want to focus on in the third and fourth quarter, because that's what's likely going to win you tournaments and or at least minimum rounds. In that, framing the debate allows you to understand how to evaluate or impact your arguments. How do we kind of understand this? If you read that middle section or middle paragraph, it has the words value and value criterion. Values are ethical objectives that we want to obtain, right? You can read there that some of them are justice, morality, liberty. And so when you're thinking about building your contentions, you could explain possibly that the way that we exist right now, where people in the United States live in poverty, that it's inaccessible to afford basic needs, is unjust. And so you can possibly explain that justice should be what we need to seek and what we need to achieve in the world. Or alternatively, morality, in that the actions that we take have to be the most moral, and that we have to approach the world in certain ways in which we promote the capacity for people to interact in that world, right? So then the second part would be value criterions, in that you explain the specific way to get there. Let's assume that we're going with the value of justice. With a universal basic income topic, we want to achieve justice for people who have been shut out economically in the United States. A value criterion is the way that we achieve that. In that, we could just say outright that universal basic income is the way that we achieve justice. But that's kind of iffy. Let's take it on a more broader scope, in that the way that we achieve justice could be through quality of life, or it could be through a much more equalized economy, right? And so you could say that these two things that we're attempting to achieve, be like the equalized economy or other, is the way that we achieve justice. And so when you're thinking about this topic as universal basic income, think about it as the ways in which you can achieve this large understanding in the round, be it morality, justice, quality of life, liberty, any of them, and think about how can I explain to the judge why this one matters? And then two, how your contentions best achieve these. When I work with my students, one of the things that I want to really focus on this quarter is explaining that the way that you can often shut out arguments on the other side is to explain why your side or your arguments best achieve these types of frameworks or this type of values because the other side doesn't necessarily engage with them, or that these just matter more fundamentally to the round. It might be confusing. If you have any questions, you can contact me. My email is going to be in a number of the files that I'll link in the bottom of the description. Okay. Do. What are thirdly aspects of universal basic income? These are a few that I have right here. I thought the infographic was very cute and I liked it. Firstly, it's periodic in that, universal basic income could be like every month, every other month, and generally aren't like lump sum payments, but they are cash payments, or like, they could go to a bank. That's however you want to explain it. This is what this infographic wants to explain it as, in that we could think of it as people getting access to benefits with, less limitations. Universal and universal basic income means that there is no people who are cut off from it. So if a proposition team wants to explain that, oh, rich people aren't going to get any access to it, possibly that could be a potential way to look at it, but that isn't necessarily what the debate is about. And so I think that you're not likely to be within the realms of the debate, but it's kind of the smaller part to understand universal basic income. The two that actually really matter is individual and unconditional, in that on an individual basis it is paid to sole individuals versus like, household based, which is often what we see in a number of the social service programs right now in the United States. But then secondarily, unconditional, in that a lot of the programs we have right now require, you to work or require you to not work, the unemployment benefits versus certain social welfare programs. This ignores all of it, in that it is unconditional. There's no reason why you would not get it unless, like you're dead. And there's no way that you would be denied it unless extenuating circumstances existed. And so when you're thinking about characterizing universal basic income, think of these five characteristics. These are what we're talking about when we're talking about universal basic income. And so we're understanding the way that these five aspects interact with the world. Speaking of the world, here's another pretty photo that I saw. This just shows you a number of different ways that universal basic income exists in the world, in that you can read all of these different ways that it exists. But I just want to talk about Alaska real quick. You'll see that Alaska is the one that has the funniest color, or at least color pattern, in that it's unique, in that the permanent fund dividend, if you really just think about it, okay, not really, but a little bit, is a form of universal basic income, in that the incentives to live in Alaska and the money that we have from oil revenue goes towards its citizens in a yearly installment that changes every year based upon the governor's decision. Maybe Dunleavy will raise it one year. But you can think of it as that when you're trying to explain to your judge what it looks like, or at least how they can conceptualize it, it wouldn't be bad to explain how the PFD, the permanent fund dividend, is kind of a pseudo universal basic income, and that often the steps to get it, like applying, having residency, being citizen, being here for a certain number of years, or having certain requirements, give the characteristics of how to get access to universal basic income. I would encourage you to look at different specific places. Specifically, go read about Ontario, Canada, and then go read about Finland, because they have very two contrasting and different stories. Let's talk about Ontario. So this is a fun article that I found, and I thought that it kind of explained a few important ways to look at it. And I thought that was really funny that one of the authors' names was Wayne, because my name is Wayne. Okay, Benefits to universal basic income exists in a number of different ways. This study, in this article, based upon 1,000 recipients, found a number of different ones. Firstly, they found that 71% of people felt less tired and had less physical pain. And so we can think of this as that people, when they have the money necessary and feel like less stressed as a result, are less likely to be in positions where they suffer. Also, they found that people generally ate better, and we can often correlate that to people having healthier lives. We could also think of it further that people are more engaged with their community through extracurricular activities and through volunteering, and also that they found that more people became employed after the pilot program had started. In that Ontario's example of universal basic income was a pilot program that they tested for a few years before either the regional or national government turned it off. And so understanding these things, this would be a very good positive example of how it has benefited. But you can also think of it as like there's a number of different ways that just this alone could counter a number of different arguments. Because when you're think initially, I know that a lot of people that have started building cases have made the argument on opposition like, oh, if universal basic income exists, then people don't have the incentive to work, which one is factually untrue, but two, there's also proven evidence that this isn't necessarily the case in test examples. And so think about when you're doing research on universal basic income, why or why not certain conditions exists and why not people's arguments actually come about and how you can best respond to them. Okay. And just some last stuff on framework. Framework, you can look at these as a number of different ones, either cost benefit analysis, utilitarianism, human rights, national security. For the purposes of trying to move through, I'm going to let you read that real quick. Moving through this topic lecture, I'm not really going to discuss this section any further. But again, when you're trying to explain to your judge, right? Let's assume that you Okay, let's assume that you're trying to explain the outcomes of this Ontario example to your judge. All of these are positive, really good benefits. But if you don't explain to your judge the ways that you should understand it or the ways that you should look at it, then it doesn't really come across as being a winning argument. And that framework serves as a way for your judge to understand it and for you to win on it. Okay, let's talk about arguments for and against. This is why you're really here. Let's go here. Yeah, this is good enough. Okay. The first case from Britannica article released last year is that universal basic income reduces poverty and income inequality and improves physical and mental health. I think this is a pretty standard case in that if UBI is set at a certain rate, if you look at the first paragraph, studies from the Economic Security Project show that it would eradicate poverty in the United States, but that also in certain pilot programs like Kenya's ongoing trial, it has led to higher increase of happiness and life satisfaction. So you can very well explain to your judge in this argument that when UBI exists or when people have higher access towards income, in that when people are best able to feel when best able to either work less or just have the money necessary to live their life, there's better outcomes as a result. And I think this is a very clear story for your judge. And I wouldn't find that a lot of these arguments, if framed out very correctly, would struggle in a number of rounds. I think these are very solid arguments, and I think that if you can explain to your judge a number of different ways as to why reducing physical and mental health struggles matters, I think that arguments like these are often ones that are going to win. Contention two, universal basic income leads to positive job growth and better educated citizens. Specifically, in that universal basic income protects from sluggish wage growth, but also gig economies and automation in the workplace. So let's try and build a story here using this argument. Let's think of conditions in the world right now as to why we would need to consider sluggish wage growth, gig economies, and automation in the workplace. Well, AI is increasingly being used, and so there's less jobs available in tech sectors or in automation sectors as a result, as we are actively automatizing the manufacturing industry. You could also think of it as gig economies, like the rise of DoorDash and Uber Eats, means that people are having less steady incomes. And so you can explain all of these on a number of different bases that right now in the world, there's inconsistent money, but that under UBI, that it sees higher economic output, employment, prices, and wages. You can look at their example for the Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, which saw 10,000 increases in jobs. And I think that these types of arguments generally are very defensive, but also offensive at the same time. But they're only an offensive argument if you're able to explain the preconditions or like the context as to why we need these types of arguments. Okay. Okay, we're back. Technical difficulties. Let's keep going through these arguments. Okay, third proposition argument, and the last one we'll cover, is that UBI reduces gender inequality. So this argument specifically is what we call a stakeholders argument or an actor analysis motion. In that you have to explain to your judges the specific context in which why gender inequality, specifically in economics, continues to exist, in that women are generally paid less than men, in that women are less able to get jobs than men, in that women are seen in less higher corporate positions than men, in that women have less management positions than men. You can explain all of those, right? And so you can say that that's necessarily bad for a number of different reasons. But once you've done the pre-work of explaining why that's bad, you can then finally explain that basic income systems reduce those inequalities for the reasons listed here by the paragraph, or by explaining your own ways. In that, when women receive UBI, they have higher capacity to make household decisions. In that, they are more likely to be empowered and have better capacity for social advocacy. You can explain a number of different ways. This contention, relative to the other two, is ways that you characterize people who are affected by universal basic income, and that this same argument could work if you want to talk about minorities. In that, it's very easy to explain how the economy essentially is built for like white men, and that by using universal basic income, it's equalizing the economy to a higher degree, so that it's not necessarily just built for white men, but that all people are more included in it, and you can explain the positive outcomes as a result from that. Arguments like these are likely to be very convincing to a judge. Okay, let's go to opposition. And yes, the background is black. I don't know why. Wait, I made the lecture. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, first argument is that UBI increases poverty by giving to everyone instead of targeting the poor. This is inherently a defensive argument, in that universal basic income takes money away through taxes or takes money away by limiting certain alternative programs for distribution without actually understanding why inequality is occurring in the status quo. How would we think about this? This would essentially be a taxes argument, but there's a number of different ways to think about it. Firstly, that when you have universal basic income, that would take someone to a higher economic bracket, in that let's say that I make mm, $30,000 a year, but I have a universal basic income, I'm now up to $40,000. It actually raises the percentage that I have to pay in taxes because the United States is a gradual tax rate system. But let's assume that that is addressed in the model. You can also think of it as how, with the government, given their current crusade against social programs, aren't likely to fund both universal basic income but also high levels of social release services. And so you can think of it as a trade-off argument. And so you can often explain that universal basic income doesn't explain why people who are in lower economic brackets stay there even if finances is given. And so this is a very defensive argument, but it does mitigate a lot of the offense. And you can actually use it as an offensive argument to say that actually, if you do universal basic income, we aren't likely to have other anti-poverty measures. And so it means that it's an all or nothing strategy, and we're likely to see worse outcomes as a result. Okay. Second argument is that it's just too friggin' expensive. In that, $2,000 per month estimates to about 2.2 and a quarter trillion annually. And so we can think of this as that right now we've already have a preset budget under Trump's big beautiful bill or whatever monetary policy we have set for the next 2-3 years. And so trying to fit this into a US budget, given the current state of our very volatile economy with the tariffs, or a very insecure economy based on just perceptions about it, that putting this into the economy um, makes people very concerned and is likely to have very negative economic effects as people's relationship with taxes, people's relationships with their own finance, and how possibly that even that the government isn't likely able to pay for it. You can explain how deficit spending is bad. You can explain how raising the debt would be bad. You can explain a number of different things of that. But just on the net thesis, that trying to do it in the United States is just too darn expensive. And so you would often have to explain how government budgeting is very important and why going over budget is necessarily bad. You can often look towards a number of our past administrations as proof of that. Last argument Universal basic income removes the incentive to work. Now, I said at the beginning that this is an untrue argument. That doesn't mean that it doesn't have solid foundation. Specifically, that there's been enough economic studies, specifically out of Switzerland, to explain that the incentives for work go away, but that specifically it's less about the incentives, but about labor and skill markets. In that universal basic income encourages people to seek mobility in jobs rather than stay in specific ones, which actually lead to the highest capacity for skill refinement and labor refinement in the economy. And so like it means that the economy becomes much more volatile. You can explain why that's a bad thing as a result, but that specifically that sorry, just to clarify, that specifically that incentives to work isn't that no one's going to work, period, but that people are less likely to stay in a job and be able to have like better things on their resume or be able to have long-term skills that are be able to be refined because universal basic income pushes them to spend less time at each of their jobs. And so those are kind of the arguments I see for and against on both sides. At least ones are going to be very common. Hashtag thank you, Britannica. And so to just one last note on this motion that this debate is won or lost in the first speaker. And so if you can explain in the beginning why certain actions will and won't occur based upon the change that is universal basic income implementation in the United States, then I think you're very likely to gain a lot of ground with your judges and make the debate much easier for yourself. And so if you have any questions, come talk to me either in class if you're one of my middle school students, or send me an email. I'll put it in the description, or you can message the middle school director, the middle school debate director, and I can often forward it to me. Good luck in your rounds. I hope to see you there. I will be judging the tournaments. Until then, choose.